What could be a record-setting? A jury awarded a family $6 million after finding that a Dothan doctor botched his care for a woman who had undergone surgery. News 4's Ken Curtis examines this lawsuit, and we hear from those who believe their mother should not have died when she did.
It was very emotional.
Betsy Swihart fought back tears.
Because it's been 7 years of waiting.
7 years since she lost her mother. 71-year-old Ann Davis had gallbladder surgery in 2017, went home, and then things unraveled. This lawsuit claims she went back to Dr. Bradley Marker, a Wiregrass surgical physician who cared for her.
And she was just pretty much dismissed, told to go back home, and she died later that night.
Following a 5-day trial, jurors took barely 30 minutes to return their verdict against Dr. Marker after hearing from expert witnesses, and awarded the Davis family $6 million.
This jury believed that Miss Ann should have had different care, and that care ought to go to others who have come behind her now.
Something else about Dr. Marker bothers the Davis family even more than his care.
He went back in the record and tried to, quote, paint a different narrative about who was at blame, who was at fault. And instead of taking it on himself, he blamed her parents.
I mean, it's been difficult. It has really been difficult.
In Dothan, Ken Curtis, your hometown news leader.
Courthouse pundits say they can't remember another medical malpractice judgment reaching $6 million. We reached out to Dr. Marker's attorney for comment, but have not heard back.